Good morning to everybody. Good morning. Hi.
Good morning. We are just about to start. You should be able to now see my screen.
Yeah, we see it.
Okay,
Yes, we see.
Thank you very much. Keep in mind that I may not necessarily see your raised hands, so if you have questions, feel free to, or a remark, feel free to step in. Otherwise, we will go through questions once the presentation is over. So, good morning once again. Today is our final webinar of the Protect training curriculum, and we would focus on identifying and structuring the demand for climate services when it comes to prediction and prevention of different types of fires. My name is Stefka Domozova, and I have prepared this with the help of my colleagues, Tanzane and Antonio Mateis, who would also support us today. So first of all, what we will talk about today is a little bit about climate services and about why it matters knowing what climate services are. And then we will talk about the connection of PCP. This is an acronym you will see throughout, and it stands for pre-commercial procurement. We will talk about that a little bit, also with about the connection between pre-commercial procurement and climate services and how are they meant to help each other. We will be talking about local authorities and how they currently prioritize the prevention of fires, and how these relate to other climate hazards. Before that, let's maybe spend a word on Protect, for if there are some of you who haven't joined us before or who are less familiar with the project. So Protect is a Horizon Europe project. Its goal is to raise awareness and build capacity for the use of pre-commercial procurement in the co-creation of climate services. So very, very broadly, we create materials like that. We do webinars. We create capacity under different forms, but also more specifically, we also support future consortia that would take part of the call that you see on the screen in green. This is a call that has just opened, that the European Commission has launched on the co-creation of climate services through pre-commercial procurement. So our idea is to make sure that the audience, the people that would apply for this goal, but also more broadly, know what pre-commercial procurement is and how to make the best of the process. So we do talk about pre-commercial procurement beyond the scope of the call as well, but this call is a very nice opportunity to get if you're a public authority, to get your pre-commercial procurement fully funded by the European Commission and not having to invest your own funds into that. On the bottom of your screen, you would see 4 topics that we have reached. We have narrowed down quite a bit so far over the last almost a year and a half of the project. And these are the 4 topics where we have current procurers that have manifested themselves as having interest to proceed with the pre-commercial procurement for the purposes of the call. And today we are talking about fires prediction and prevention. A little bit about pre-commercial procurement. I realize that it may sound very, very technical, and in a way it is, but if you don't know much about pre-commercial procurement, everything that you probably need to know for the context of today's workshop is to know that the main principle of pre-commercial procurement is that it represents competitive development in phases, which means that if we, for instance, take classical procurement, where all the terms all the terms on the tender are already there, and then let's say the public authority is looking for someone to execute these very specific terms. It's a little bit different about pre-commercial procurement. It is very often used in for instance, in climate services, only in fields that require very high level of technicalities, where, for instance, the public procurers cannot really write that technical of requirements for one reason or another, maybe because they don't really have the capacity, but also maybe because they don't really know what's on the market to that extent. So the idea of pre-commercial procurement is that there is a group of procurers, in most of the cases public authorities, and there's a group of service developers who respond to the call saying that they should be capable to correspond the needs as initially described by the public procurers. And as you see in on this graph, on each stage of the research and development, there are only few suppliers that that continue, and it's the suppliers whose solution is the most adapted to the needs of the public buyers. Pre-commercial procurement, another very important thing is that only considers the R&D phase. So here we are typically talking about TRL between 3 and 7. But what matters is that we're talking about very early stage development, which is on the one hand very nice for the service developers themselves, because it's not that easy to get funding for that stage. But on the other hand, once the product has been developed, of course, this development is fully funded, but then the public procurers, they are not obliged to purchase the service. So this is something that goes beyond the pre-commercial procurement. I hope that's clear. Here is a little bit of overview of the training curriculum of the webinars we have run so far this autumn over the past few weeks. We have talked a little bit more in advance about, in depth, about the aspects of pre-commercial procurement, how it relates to other concepts, and we have talked about, as I showed you earlier, the four different challenges that we have narrowed so far, and how to identify our needs in relation to that. Furthermore, we had a run of training curriculum also this spring. There you could have also more materials, find more materials and videos on pre-commercial procurement, and also a little bit more on climate services, on climate markets, and a little bit more context. So don't hesitate to check the Protect website for that. And I think that colleagues of mine have already shared the link, or that they will very soon. And this is where we are today at our last of the series webinars. And so we will talk a little bit more about fires prediction and prevention. But before that, we will talk more broadly about climate services, because that's really the core of the call, but also the core of the needs that we're trying to target here. And so what are climate services? And it's not that easy to answer. There are many definitions of climate services. The one we use the most is the one that's being used by the European Commission in the 2015 Roadmap of Climate Services. And what is important is that, according to this definition, climate services uses climate data, very often in combination with non-climate data, for instance, socioeconomical data, and to transform it into something that can be useful for the society at large. Then the form that these climate services can take is something that I found very interesting, because they talk about applications, projections, and forecast, but climate services can be something as simple as a report, for instance, or a map. So this is also a form of climate services, and this is what we talk about when we talk about climate services, taking climate data and transforming it for it to be good for the society, very often, as I said, with non-climate data. And why is this important? Well, it is important because there are many studies, from independent studies and from the European Commission, that projects that tell us that the market of climate services is very undeveloped, that it is very difficult to know what is in offer. It's unfortunately very much not like a supermarket when you go and you can see on the shelf everything you need and know what is there. So what this causes is that there's also a problem in when it comes to forming one's demand for climate services. As we don't know what is out there generally, it is very difficult to know, first of all, if what is out there satisfies our needs and if we can use it off the shelf, or if it doesn't. So we have to look for other solutions, such as co-development solutions, for instance, a pre-commercial procurement, or others that allow us for the solution to be strictly corresponding to our maybe very particular needs or sets of needs. So this is why it is important to know what climate services are and which climate services are out there. And this is, as of today, really not easy. When it comes to fire prediction and prevention, and a little bit to our previous point, one of the tools that we have nowadays for knowing what is on the market are taxonomies. Depending on the taxonomy, they could be very, well, a bit complicated or bulky tools to navigate, but it's a very nice way to still see an overview of what is there. For instance, this is an extract from the Protect taxonomy that we had to narrow down during our research out for the purposes of the Protect project. And what you see there are different services in the right column. It's currently services that exist off the shelf. So it's not necessarily something that has to be developed through pre-commercial procurement, for instance, but it gives a nice overview of the state of play and what is out there. And also what it shows us, here we have tried to filter it according to those that are related to fire, that there are many different services that or aspects we don't necessarily think of that could either feed into fire services or that can, or which can be fed from the data that comes from services related to fire prediction and prevention. The Protect taxonomy is also available on our website, so feel free to have a look there and to play a little bit around with whatever your needs are. So as I anticipated a little bit earlier, throughout the Protect project, we have narrowed down to 4 specific challenges, thanks to our colleagues who were in charge of the so-called pain point workshops. So what we did there was talking to pre-commercial procurement, to public procurers, and through different methodologies, trying to figure out what were their needs in the specific domains, what is their interest for potential pre-commercial procurement, and as the title of the workshop states, what are their pain points of getting there or reaching the service. So for instance, when it came down to prediction and prevention, we had quite some interest for waste dump fires. And the problem had a little bit two different aspects, that there were in several countries, there seemed to be in waste storage facilities, there seem to be fires, sometimes even more than once a year in the same facility. So it was very complicated, despite having some factors and parameters that have already been followed and monitored. It seemed very complicated to have a solution that was that could foresee that, so that it could be prevented, or even more, it was very difficult, and it still is, to talk about tracing the cause of the fire and potentially having even maybe enough data in certain cases to identify and prosecute the perpetrators. So this is just an example of one of the interests that was expressed for potential PCP. It had to do with fires, and of course that's not the only concern we have when it comes to fires and climate. So for instance, some of the relevant framework we have there is the EU Waste Framework Directive, which is which targets every EU country, and it gives broad directions on how waste should be treated. And then more specifically, we know that on national level, we have different laws on waste or waste management, and it could be in broader environmental law, it could be in specific laws, or sometimes it's even at regional level. So that makes it also adds another layer of complexity to how things can be tackled. Also, because when it comes to regional level, sometimes it's more difficult to put different regions together for them to have a common solution, or a solution that can satisfy the needs according to their different legislations. This was just a little bit the framework. Last but not least, I really like showing this picture, and it just, you see very pretty picture of a park. You don't really see a fire, let alone a dump fire, but waste fire, but it's just to remind you how different factors and risks interact in an ecosystem. So that's also the case very much when it comes down to fires. And I would just like to remind you to maybe try to map and think a little bit out of the box, and knowing that fires are not just fires. We all know that they're very often instigated by different factors, and that often fires themselves can have consequences on other ecosystems. So this was the presentation part of today, and what we would do now is we would try to discuss with those of you, especially those of you that have experience in public procurement, ideally from the side of public authorities, because there are public authorities that procure services, or because they work with public authorities that procure services, or maybe from the provider side for the very same reason. So we would do this over 2 sessions. The first one would aim to talk about what is the status quo, and we have called it identifying externalities. And all these long words are pretty much there to remind us that there are sometimes things that don't quite work, and maybe they could be tackled. And then we would move on to the second session, that assuming that once we have identified these externalities, we could continue to see what we can do to get rid of them, and how would that influence a potential structuring of our demand for climate services, including very specifically for pre-commercial procurement, but not only. All right. Maybe just a second here, so that I could stop sharing my screen and make sure that I can see you. You can still see my screen, right?
Yes, yeah, we see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. All right. So our first very low-ball question is: do you currently have enough data to identify the fire-prone areas in the cities, in the areas that you're responsible of? Does anyone want to maybe start with introduce themselves and start with that one? Again, as a public procurer, public entity, or maybe as someone who has experience working with public entities.
Maybe it's sorry, I'm so trying time here. I'm not intending to speak a lot today, because as you can hear, my voice is almost off, but can maybe put a few cents on that. So I'm not a public procurer personally, but we've been interacting with quite a few. I think maybe something that is a subset of this question is in fact which kind of fire risks are involved. So there's one kind of fire risks which has been the focus of a group, and Lucia could say a lot more about that, which is waste-related fires. So that's of course an important and quite a difficult one to trace and monitor. So that's probably why some procurers in our previous groups have said they were particularly interested in exploring PCP possibilities for such risks, because they are again not straightforward. But of course there are some which come from more let's say less disseminated, less scattered elements in the city. So there are cities where you have almost not wasteland, let's not exaggerate, but you have green spaces which are not necessarily well tended, which haven't been monitored over time. And so in fact the fire risk is there in a way. It's very apparent, but it's not really been measured and taken care of, for instance. So that's one thing. There are things which are more modern, more recent, and one a bit cliche example, but it's still, of course, real. It's about the fast development of vegetal covers on walls and things like that. And in fact, there has been some not very happy experiments where this dimension of risk was simply not properly taken on board. And so, how do you deal with that? So I suppose in the question of do you have enough data to identify the fire-prone areas, there is a data component, which is in terms of the fingers, the numbers, the observation data, but there's also the analysis of where you should look. So I think that's I see the second question is about the how you are made aware of the fire risk, and I think that's probably what would be interesting to bring in. So, sorry, I will spare you with my voice going forward. Maybe, Ana Lucia, as you have discussed with procurers who are really working on that, you probably have insight on that. But if there are participants in the call who are themselves procurers or have been working with them on that topic, please come in. We're looking at multiple perspectives here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tam Tam. I was thinking of answering some of the questions that you have there. Based on information that we receive or discuss with the public buyers in the challenge of fire. And the first question is, do you have enough data to identify the fire-prone areas in your city or in your area? I think there are data available in some extent, but yeah, all the data needs to be used. For example, they mentioned having historical data on, for example, when they had the fires, what type of temperature they had on those times. Often in summer times, they have data about the size or the height of the piles of garbage that's accumulated, or the type of the substances or type of garbage that generates more fire. So these are some of the data they have, but of course they need to combine data with the possibility to visualize the space, and the idea is to have a combination of data like weather forecast to know what the temperature is going to be, whether there's going to be some kind of conditions that can generate the fires. So having this data that they already have from past experience with data that is generated on the time can help them have these automatic solutions to alert or prevent these type of fires. The other question is, how are you made aware of the risk, of the fire risk? In the case that they were presented is those companies or industries who store fire, or who store the garbage, or have a lot of things accumulated. They have these risks, and they have these consequences of having this waste accumulated in the heat. And of course, the environmental agencies need to take care of these. They get the alarm, or they get also to firefighters or other first responders to reach the place where the fire is. But on the other hand, there are also other actors like the environmental agencies that need to control whether this fire is causing contamination and pollution of the air. So they do have some of the data on the historical data, for example. The question is in which format they have data. I guess some of it's digital, some not. What are the concerns addressed internally within your department? Okay, that's communication in this case between the industry or companies and also the environmental agencies and the public sector. So that was the case presented. And how do they collaborate? At the moment, it's more to respond to this fire and to have some sanctions in the case of these circumstances where they have polluted the air, etc.
Also, my understanding is that sometimes there is data, but it's not maybe the right format of data or the right source of data, because, for instance, we know that for authorities or companies that are in charge, as you said, Ana Lucia, of waste storages, they have to report the amount and the amount of them that is stored there, but also what is it. But we have also been aware of some cases where it wasn't really clear if that has been reported correctly. So sometimes, for instance, there may be maybe some data that is not necessarily self-reported, where we could be maybe more assured that that the data can be, well, let's say more objective and more useful for prevention and prediction. So that's, I would like to invite you also to think of, well, there's certain data, but is that necessarily the good type of data and the right type of data? Can we have better data for, of course, not too expensive, because that's always a constraint. Yes, Joseph? Go ahead, please.
Yes, Stefka, I would continue what you pointed out, and I think that's relevant for also Ministry of Interior environmental crime units. When we talk with them also about the use cases, they mentioned, of course, let's say the need for let's say evaluating the amount of the waste before and after the fire, but they pointed out also the need for verifying the data that we already have, or not the ministry, but some of the institutions responsible for analyzing and collecting the data about the waste storage and amount of the waste stored in these storages, because what they realize is that obviously the company that runs the waste storage sites are responsible for collecting the information about what kind of storage is stored there, and that is basically I think based on the data that the companies, the transport companies that deliver the waste there are providing them. But they realize that sometimes these data are not correct. So let's say the climate services, based on other observation, could verify the data that these facilities provide to the institutions like Ministry of Interior and crime units. So, and when it comes to, I think the first questions, this is really, I mean, we know, or our investigators, they know that usually the waste storage facilities are basically the areas that are prone to the fire. Now, when it comes to the use cases, the first use case deals with fire that is involuntary, so mainly more concerning and relating to the environment. And the use cases that we pointed out is more for more related to the voluntary fires started at the waste storage facility. So I would answer in this way.
Sorry, I just changed the slide back to the use cases in case someone needs to differentiate about it. All right, thank you very much. I think that maybe we have answered to this first slide. We have talked quite a bit about waste fires. However, that's not the only type of fires that happen, unfortunately. So if someone has more insights of working with procurers or what the needs are there, feel free to share it. Otherwise, we could just move to the second slide if we only want to focus on that. Antonia?
I could talk briefly about forest fires and how Earth observation can be used to map fuel load. So that's something that a colleague of mine was involved with in a European project that was called Fire EU Risk. So they were, it's a funny acronym, as they often are. They were working with Earth observation data and trying to identify high-risk fire areas that are also on the urban, what do they call it? I think urban rural periphery. So that's what you have often, that a fire would start in a forest that is adjacent to a settlement, and then you would have the risk of the fire spreading into the settlement, which would then, you know, also become a threat to human life. Of course, you always have the issue of air pollution with fires as well, which is an often, I think, underreported outcome of a fire, also of a waste fire. I remember I live in Amsterdam, and there was a big waste fire in the waste processing facility that's in the west of the city, up by the harbor. Sorry, I think about a year or two ago. And it was so bad that the entire city got those alerts on the phone that you should stay indoors because the air quality was so dangerous that even if you are not sensitive to changes in air quality, it would be actually very damaging for your health. So I think there's, sorry, this is not only about forest fires now, but I think there is overall also a really important health component to fires. So about this, yeah, thank you, Tantam. You, oh yeah, it is a risky and volatile name. Yes, indeed. So they were mapping the fuel load along the periphery of forests. And by fuel, basically it means like small bushes, brushes, also just dried sticks, branches that would be really an optimal load to fuel a fire. And they used Earth observation data for this. So I would quickly look for the outcome because I think they made a very nice report, and I will put that in the chat because I think it provides a really nice perspective, first of all, on forest fires, but also shows how Earth observation really can be used to identify fire risk and at a very high level of granularity.
I think that's very interesting, and it's a very nice example also of how different factors could be monitored and then maybe integrated within informatics systems with other factors, so we can have a broader overview of the risks with the scope of prevention. But as you said, also pretty much once it has happened, to think about the consequences in other domains, such as notably health, that comes from all sorts of fires.
Yeah, absolutely.
If there is no other observations on that, maybe we can move to the second session, the one that had to do about, well, now we have talked about how things are, and maybe now we can talk about how we can use them, how we can use that to improve them and make sure that we know what is more or less, at least, what are our needs for climate services, and ideally how to even put that into a tender for pre-commercial procurement. All right, so the first question is if you could improve the analysis and structure of the NISC for fire risk assessment within your organization, especially when it comes down to drafting a PCP. And I think it has to do with the fact that very often we do talk, as Antonia and Natalie pointed earlier, about different risks and maybe different departments in an organization that are not necessarily in touch with each other. And sometimes I think that even within the organizations themselves, the risk at hand is not necessarily mapped beyond what is obvious, to see how it relates to other risk, and therefore to other departments who could maybe have their own requirements, but very often they may even have solutions, because we know that sometimes different parts of organization would collect different data, use different services, and maybe not really exchange their data. I don't know if any of you has similar experiences and want to tell us how these things work in their organization, or how they work in organization they have been in contact with.
Maybe.
Oh, sorry,
Go ahead.
My view was just kind of as an outsider, as I was working more in research before. I imagine that it's very difficult to think of kind of a how do you call it, like a blueprint of what the needs are. since they would be completely different even in different parts of a city, you know. So if you are managing the part of the city that has the waste processing plant, that would be a very different needs assessment than if you are managing a different part of the city that, you know, could still be affected by a fire in a waste processing plant, like by the smoke that could you know, waft over the whole city. But it's a very different kind of data need that you have. So my first reaction would be that it would be very complex and would probably require quite a lot of thinking and workshopping the different needs. And I think, as is often the case when we try and plan for these kinds of events, especially if they are unexpected and if they are also climate related, is that only afterwards we figure out what we would have needed to have a better response. So I imagine that even though, of course, you would hope not to have to go through an event like this, I think the key phase is actually, if you have experienced a fire, how you kind of collect data afterwards and then do some brainstorming on, okay, what data would we have needed before this fire to be able to respond better? What can we learn from this event? So that's what I would think would be very useful. But I'm also curious to hear what others in the call might have to add.
Sorry, Santam, did you want to chime in? Okay, maybe not.
Sorry, no, not particularly what I would have suggested, but I think Antonia gave a much better leadway to that. Is that in the pain point discussions at workshops that we had, there are probably some insights and pointers to you know, to answer some of those questions. So I don't know if any of the participants to those workshops want to step in, but I think it's really, yeah, collecting this kind of reflections.
Maybe moving on from that, we could also talk a little bit about the particular needs that have been expressed maybe during indeed the pain point workshops, about the very specific priorities that have been identified. My understanding is that that happened mostly in the case of indeed waste fires, but maybe we could take it from there, because I think a lot of things could be applicable to other fire risks as well. I don't know, Ana Lucia or Joseph, if maybe you want to talk a little bit more specifically about which are the priorities that have been pinpointed when it comes down to needs with relation to these challenges from different authorities.
What I can share is that during the discussion, one of the priority mentioned there was, I mean, that would be really the need, is to identify the culprits or the responsible for starting the fires, and it would be for the criminal proceedings. But that's something like this we would like to have. The question is if it is feasible, and we discussed it several times that probably with the data from the Copernicus and with the existing technology, not, because it's not detailed enough. So you would have to have a different different satellites,
different data source, yes,
different data
that has higher resolution.
Yes.
Or temper, and yes.
And the question then is, I mean, obviously, in the context of Protect, we are discussing and thinking about the ways how the climate services based on observation can be helpful. But the question is that, for example, for this need, maybe the easier and more cheaper solution basically would be rely on the existing cameras, right? And then have the algorithms that go through the CCTV streams. So Yeah, this was something that we, or at least for me, was quite important during our discussions.
No, indeed, it very often comes down to what's data or what sources of information do we combine and have. For instance, for some applications, well, even if the Copernicus data can be rather coarse in some aspects, this can be mitigated through the processing that has been done to the data, or through the algorithms it has been inserted to, or maybe validating with local data, maybe from local cameras. But I think this is a much more of a technical question that I'm able to answer, but it could be something that could be answered throughout the proceedings of a pre-commercial procurement. And yes. Something that we have noticed, maybe mostly in the other challenges, it has been put more explicit than it is here. It has to do with the fact that very often there are solutions, but there are not integrated solutions. So there would be solutions that provide maybe information from one source of data or two sources of data, and these are very often considered, again, disregarding other factors that can make us think of a problem in a more systemic way, think of it as an ecosystem and how factors influence each other. So we have overall observed sort of a shift from one problem, one solution dynamics when it comes to services or climate services, to the idea of, okay, maybe we should map things a little bit and see what data we need, and how these data could be data from something that I haven't considered can actually help me with my problem, even if that's not explicitly what I am thinking about. So I think this to an extent seems to be the case here, and a little bit maybe also in Antonia's example from earlier.
We have a question in the chat. Any information, statistics, or database about fire and waste facilities in Europe over the last few years? Maybe those who were in the Pain Point workshop would have some information on this.
Just a little bit about the context. Maybe, I mean, this probably exists. The demand came from procurers, so by environmental agencies or city authorities in our case, that had the feeling, that had the mandate to treat this as their priority need. So just to say that came from consolidated demand, but of a consolidated demand of few potential public procurers. So it's not something that, when it comes to methodology, it's not something that we have picked up from statistics. And I don't know if someone, indeed, as Antonio said, would be aware of statistics, and if this would be Europe-wise or maybe country-wise.
Yes, during the Pain Point workshop, there was some data presented by the public buyer, by the environmental agency, on the number of fires that there are in some countries, especially Nordic countries. And I think I'm going to post in the chat a link to a study on fires in waste facilities that is from Scandinavian perspective, but it gives some data also from Europe.
Thank you, Ana Lucia. That's very helpful.
But indeed, it's a good question. We need to find more about this data.
And maybe to wrap it up, and in case we are not repeating ourselves, maybe we could discuss a little bit very briefly about what is missing, what are the barriers, what is the information that we miss, for instance, to express our demand for a solution. As Joseph said, maybe there are certain data there which are maybe not good enough, maybe they are, but we don't really know that without going into pre-commercial procurement, which is okay, because I believe that is pretty much the scope of pre-commercial procurement, to prove or disprove our assumptions about how technology is delivered. And as long as we are clear about the need that we have, then the technical means are supposed to come together throughout the PCP process. But I'm wondering if there are some other barriers or challenges. For instance, what we have seen very often is it can be very, very basically, it could be a question of mandate. So for instance, we talked about cities, we talked about environmental agencies, but very often their mandates don't really overlap. So it can also be problematic from the perspective that the agency who has the mandate might not be the agency who has the data, or it may not be the authority that is running the PCP. So very often we have heard about having task forces, having different discussions between agency, but the problem, if we may call it like that, is that these task forces are very, by definition, they are very topic specific. So that comes down with the burden that we should already have quite a high level of awareness of the problem, which means that maybe in a perfect world we could have intervened also earlier. So this is something that we have, for instance, observed. But these task forces, where the needs, the information and data available, where we are and where we want to be, are discussed by different authorities, are, for instance, the good practice that we have been pointed out throughout, I think, even throughout the pain point workshops, if I'm not mistaken.
I think that actually Anthony's question from the chat makes a really good point, which is that probably these fires are often not reported to some kind of central database, and that if that was if there was some kind of procedure in place where you would have to report these fires and you would have to report certain statistics and information around the fire, like what we said before, if it was an accidental fire or if it was voluntarily started. I think then you could really have a database where you could look at different situations where fires occurred, see if this applies to your situation and what you can learn from those events. It's like I said earlier, we often only figure out the data that we needed after an event had occurred. But of course, it would be even better if this event didn't have to occur in every area in all of Europe for us to learn these lessons, but maybe we can transfer some of the lessons learned. So I think that is perhaps a barrier, that there just isn't enough knowledge sharing about this thing, which I imagine is also because it's often private companies that are responsible for the fire, the waste management. And so you don't have this kind of mandate of open data sharing that you might have if it was a European entity. But I can imagine that that's a barrier to really optimizing this process.
Just to sorry, build quickly on that, and I think it has been mentioned also during this session, but there's of course this whole field of legal services within the climate service area, and of course here it's particularly complex especially for the reasons you just pointed at, Antonia. But I think one of the things is how there can be some clarification on what is the responsibility once you have identified the risk of preventing it. And not just punishment after after something happens, but really how to take that into account. And that, as I think we are all aware, is both a field we know will emerge very strongly. It has started to emerge in unexpected places. I mean, even a few years ago, with some, in another field, some meteorological agencies being actually sued for not having, given sufficient warnings or things like that. But I mean, if you think of issues such as waste fires, of course, that's an area where you could think that there can be very high stakes. And on the other hand, it's something that is not yet proactively regulated the way it should be, and partly because the data are indeed scattered and because the evidence is not doesn't have a clear status. So I think one of the things is really, and that's really an open question. I'm not suggesting that it's a solution that's very major, but one of the dimensions is certainly if anything from Earth observation can be used for this, and noting, of course, what Joseph has recalled about the accuracy, granularity, resolution, and so on. But if any of this can be used is it something that needs to be fed to also regulatory and more generally legal people, to start structuring this space and making it manageable? Because my feeling is that it's just not manageable at this point, because it's too scattered and too incomplete, even in theoretical terms. So that's really just posting this open remark, and I don't know how far the PCP can help with that, but certainly if there is a dimension of that, it could be a step forward.
I very much enjoy, in principle, the dichotomy between what legal frameworks can do and what technical solutions can do. And an observation I have is that they tend to run with different speed. So you need the time to create a solution that is, of course, by definition, much quicker than the time it takes for the solution to be verified and validated, and even less being adopted by public authorities. But I very much agree that this is just indeed points at the problem, and that's how it is important that these two things interact, because it's, yes, it comes down to the legal responsibility that one bears for triggering or not triggering certain mechanisms. Then you should probably have some sort of clear checklist on when you should go for them and when you shouldn't. And this should only happen through an R&D process from a very early stage, when you can have something that has already been affirmed. Then it maybe could be part of your checklist. But I agree that also having a more systemic and broader view of that, it cannot come from the technical side of things. It can only come from, or at least throughout the support of the legal framework around that. But yes, it's the same dichotomy between technical and legal that I think pre-commercial procurement is the very expression of. So it's don't think we should have one without the other. I have been wondering if anyone would have any last remarks, because we have been advancing quite a bit with the time. So if there's anything else that you would like to share that you haven't had the opportunity, if you think that we haven't quite wrapped it up and there's some new information you want to bring on the table, I think now is the time. All right, then I would thank you all very much for taking part of the discussion. It was very focused on the waste fires, and this was, well, because we actually had real procurers bringing waste fires at an earlier stage of the problem, and of the PCP. And but once again, I would invite you to think about things a little bit more broader. Even when you think about waste fires, maybe think about forest fires and what is the experience that we have in forest fires that we could import and that we can learn from, because it's very, very often when we work with procurers, also again because of the mandate they have, they tend to work very much in silos, and that's understandable, but it's certainly not the only way. So I would, if you have to take one thing from today, I would just say, like, have a look around and see what's available. Yes, Tantam, go ahead.
Yes, and I should really refrain from talking with my voice, but just an open invitation, not just on this webinar, but the whole series of training webinars for anybody who watches this, after not live, but afterwards, or sees it again. If you have any reflections, contributions that touch to any of those questions, please do reach out and share them, because they will be very useful in the next steps of the Protect process, of course, but also of the PCP call. And of course, the best way to share it is to join the community and maybe some of the working groups. But in any case, it's just to say that's not those webinars are really not meant to be closed at all. They're really rather opening doors to further reflection. So we look very much forward to that.
I couldn't have said that better myself. Today is our last webinar, so thank you to all of you that attended also the previous one. Thank you for all of you for attending today. And the presentations and The recordings of the previous webinars are already available online. This will be available very soon on the link that Antonia just shared on the chat. But indeed, please keep in mind that this is just one of the tools we have in Protect, and we are still making our best for building capacity and some dissemination around what is the role of pre-commercial procurement and climate services. So if you have any ideas or questions, please reach out to us at any time, and we will be happy to respond and to maybe work on it together. Thank you very much. Have a lovely week ahead, and check out the Protect website. Thank you. Bye.
Many thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Have a nice day. Bye.